All right, we are live. So my name is Jessica McDuffie. I'm a licensed professional counselor associate with Connections Child and Family Center. And thank you so much for joining us on our webinar today of Making Sense of the Unthinkable. Really going to dive deep into looking at and understanding self-harm, suicidality, and how they impact teens and adolescents. Some of the things that I hope that you'll learn from our presentation today is one, maybe just dispelling a few myths or assumptions that we may kind of have about self-harm or suicidality. Also, I want us to kind of maybe define and look at to define terms of what self-harm is versus suicidality. They're words we use in conjunction a lot, but they can be separate, and they are separate. I also want us to kind of learn and recognize signs of maybe when we can tell that our teen or our child is potentially dealing with some of these issues, and also understand potential triggers or motives so that we can better know how to support our teens and adolescents as they struggle with some of these things. As I dive in, I want to give you a little bit of information about myself. So like I said, my name is Jessica McDuffie. I'm a licensed professional counselor associate. I have 5+ years of experience in working in mental health. I initially got my bachelor's degree in criminal justice and worked in a few prisons, but then transitioned into mental health because I really wanted a more rehabilitative focus than punitive. And so I have experience working in residential treatment for adolescent girls who'd been sex trafficked. I also worked at a local mental health agency in the community, and I recently joined here at Connections. So I'm really excited to be here and be a part of this team. Particular things that I'm trained in and love to do in our sessions would be cognitive behavioral therapy, trauma-focused behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, which I'm going to share more specifically about that one at the end, and also motivational interviewing. So some myths we may have when thinking about self-harm or suicide. The first one is again, like I said at the very beginning, is we kind of make them one and the same. We tend to believe that self-harm is a suicide attempt. However, research kind of shows that people can have self-harm behaviors without having any suicidal thoughts or ideations at all. And so we'll kind of dig into maybe why someone would self-harm without the ideas of suicide, and what that kind of looks like a little bit later on. Another myth that we also kind of tend to believe, especially with teens and adolescents, is that self-harm is an attention-seeking behavior, or it could be a form of manipulation, right? Again, research also shows us that this is less accurate. I'm not going to say this never happens, but it is rarer for this to happen. Self-harm generally is a form of communication. It's a cry for help, and it is a way to try and attract people, but more as a sense of, look how badly I'm hurting, or look how badly I need help. I just don't know how to vocalize it. And again, that's something we'll kind of dig into a little bit deeper. But this myth also kind of ties in with our next myth. Our next myth is that young people, teens and adolescents primarily, self-harm to fit in. And again, the research kind of indicates that this is also false. And how we see this is that teens and adolescents actually do not look fondly upon other people who are rather vocal about their self-harm. There's a lot of shame in regard to both self-harm and suicidal ideation. So it's not something that people openly talk about. And if it is something that's openly talked about, quite frankly, teens aren't very warm and welcoming to that. I've even had clients of my own who are teens and adolescents who struggled with their own self-harm and suicidality, and they will sit in their chair in my office and they will criticize their peers and people at school who are very vocal about their own struggles with self-harm and suicidality. So it's both something that research says, but something I've also observed as a clinician, that this isn't something that's accepted or praised at all amongst adolescents. Also, we tend to see that self-harm is just a phase that teens will grow out of, or we tend to believe that. We don't see it, to be honest. We do see an increase of self-harm in adolescent ages, and we'll see that when I kind of dive into statistics. But we see that because it generally from ages 14 to early to mid-20s, there is a heightened increase of self-harm or suicidal ideations. And this somewhat developmentally makes sense because these are the primal ages where kids and individuals start to learn and deal with and cope with kind of stressors on their own, right? And so as they're trying to kind of navigate this maybe for the first time, it makes sense that many teens and adolescents fall into maladaptive or unhealthy coping skills. They go to something that seems maybe like a quick fix or a quick problem solution solver for them. But clearly we can look at it and see that this is really self-damaging, and it's not a long-term solution by any means. If anything, it causes long-term consequences. So the who. Before I get into the who, I actually want to provide you with two stories and think about the myths that we just kind of went through maybe as I tell these stories. The first story I'm going to tell is a personal story dealing with suicide and self-harm. The second is going to be more of a clinical professional story. So when I was a teen, and this is one of the reasons why I got into counseling, was that I had a lot of peers struggling with mental health. We were all somewhat aware of this with our different issues with mental health and things that we struggled with. But quite frankly, it wasn't something we talked about really open. I remember specifically one friend that I think about who we were on an overnight trip. So away from home, but we still had chaperones. And this friend had struggled with suicidal thoughts and self-harm and a lot of other mental health conditions. And I remember that an episode kind of flared up during this trip overnight, and they were just really struggling to stay safe. They really had a lot of intense urges, intense, overwhelming feelings in this moment. And me being a teen, about 16 or 17 years old, didn't know what to do for this peer. I knew I cared about them deeply. I knew I didn't want them to hurt themselves. And so all I could do in that moment was just sit with them. And I look back, getting emotional, practiced this, and I did get emotional telling it then, but I look back then and I knew how hopeless my friend was. And I saw their hopelessness and felt helpless in how to deal with it. And I think that's many people when trying to support others who deal with self-harm. We don't know what to do, or we don't know how to support. But now being a clinician and knowing what I know, just being there and holding that emotional space for that friend honestly was probably paramountly impactful for them. It made them know that they're not alone in sitting with some of these really uncomfortable, even like gross feelings, and knowing that they didn't have to sit there alone for however long they lasted, that I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving until I knew they were safe. And so knowing that they had someone to make sure that they were okay and that they didn't have to face these feelings alone, I think was really impactful. And so again, if this is something that's new for you and learning how to help and support people who deal with self-harm or suicide, take that away. That learning to just sit with some of those feelings with that person can be the biggest first step to being an open person for them to feel cared for and be able to feel open to talk to you about those issues. The professional story I want to tell, it started about a year ago. I had a client come in for an intake, an adolescent teen girl, and we were doing the intake. I had already met with the parent, and so we're kind of meeting one-on-one. And, she was like, I'm going to be really honest with you, Miss Jessica. And I said, awesome. Love that. Great way to start out therapy. And she just said, I almost didn't make it here today. And I said, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Like logistically, you just didn't want to come to the appointment, or like, are we talking about something more serious? And she said, more serious. I stole pills over the weekend to overdose. But I didn't. And I was like, okay, what kind of helped you and protected you in that moment to not overdose? And she said, honestly, knowing that I had a counseling appointment kind of gave me hope that maybe it'll stick this time and maybe it will get better. And in that moment, I told her, good. If anything gives you hope, and if that's counseling right now and knowing you have an appointment at least once a week, that's not going to change, let that be the thing that you cling to in that moment. To kind of give you hope and guidance. And that was our primary goal for the first 3 months of treatment, was to decrease that self-harm and the suicidal ideations. And quite frankly, we were really successful at it. She reported no longer having active suicidal thoughts, no longer urges to self-harm. She had some passive suicidal thoughts, and if that terminology is a little lost on you, I'm going to explain it. But she was really successful in overcoming these things. I continued to meet with her for about a year or so. And when she was ready to graduate therapy, she just looked at me and said, I'm a whole different person than when I came in. And I was like, yeah, I know. It's crazy to see how much she had learned about herself and changed and grown, and was able to kind of step out of some of these really shameful, scary, difficult feelings and urges and find ways to deal with her everyday stressors that made it capable for her to feel competent to overcome some of these really intense things that she was experiencing. So think about these two cases. I already went through the myths, but now we're going to go more statistically. I personally am not a numbers person, so statistics get a little lost on me. But I know if that I have a story or a face to put them to, it makes more sense. So the first statistic we're going to go over is about 17% of the population have self-harmed at some point in their lives. So that's adolescents and adults. At some point, 17% have self-harmed. Now, the second half of that statistic shows that approximately 90% begin during those teenage years, right? That kind of goes back to our myths that, oh, teens just self-harm as a phase. No, 90% of the people in general who self-harm, they're going to begin during those teenage years and continue into adulthood. And so that's why we see that uptick in teens who do self-harm. The next statistic kind of shows that females are more likely to self-harm than males, and that ratio is about 3-to-1. And even in my own time doing mental health work, I've noticed this. I've treated a lot more females with self-harm and suicidal behaviors than I have males. However, my caveat to that is females who tend to self-harm are going to do it at a less intense and severe rate typically. Generally, they're going to listen to that pain threshold a little bit more, and they're going to go to non-lethal options more often than not. Males are the opposite. There may be a less number of them engaging in these thoughts or behaviors, but they tend to go for more lethal options. So again, in my work, I've dealt with many females who've struggled with either of these issues. I've dealt with several males, but my male clients have always had more intense issues. And again, when I say more lethal, like we're looking at things like guns and things like that. And I have had a client attempt suicide by gun, and thankfully they lived. That was also right before our intake, ironically enough too. And we were able to get that kid in as quickly as possible when they were released from the hospital. Like that was my number one goal, to get you in. And again, we had a really successful treatment. So now we're going to jump to this last statistic, and it says non-suicidal self-injury. So again, that's those self-harm behaviors and urges that people have that are not linked to suicidal thoughts. And this is, again, most common among individuals ages 14 to 24. And again, a lot of that is that developmental learning to deal with stressful emotions and stressful situations for the first time, and not having a well-developed form of coping skills that are healthy to kind of know how to navigate that. Just a few more statistics that I think are important is that 50 to 75% of individuals who have engaged in self-harm have had at least one suicide attempt. Now, I said earlier, right, that you can have self-harm without suicide, and that's very true. So there's not a causation, but there is clearly, based on the statistics, a very high correlation. So I do think that's something to be aware of. And then lastly, more than half, so the specific numbers, 54% of adolescents who self-harm say that they only do it once or several times. This is encouraging, right? That it's not something that necessarily develops into something severe, but it obviously can be. And so catching it earlier is always better. And taking every type of self-harm or suicidal thought as seriously as the next is also important, because we want to catch it in those earlier stages. Because the earlier we do, obviously, the more treatment we can give them and the better options we can give them to kind of replace that behavior. So I talked broad scale on some statistics, but now I want to give some more specific to Montgomery County. Even if you don't live in Montgomery County, at least this gives you a snapshot of potentially what just a local mental health statistic could be, or ratio could be. So we saw from 2016 to 2021 in Montgomery County that the increase percentage-wise of mental health cases rose by 300%, which is insanely high. And from 2017 to 2021, the mental health calls to different call-in places had increased by 101%. And there may be a few reasons for this. I do think mental health is becoming more talked about. I think people are reaching out with more comfortability to receive mental health needs. But I do think also that as stressors have increased, so are the mental health issues increasing, right? And then lastly, I think this is important to note too, and this is only really highlighting publicly funded mental health services. It's not taking into account the many private practices or private type of institutions and interventions we have in the Montgomery County area. But over 70,000 adolescents and teens were served in 2022 through the publicly funded mental health services. I'll say in 2022, I was working in those publicly mental health funded services. And I can really attest that like we got in 2021 to 2022 just slammed with a lot of need for services. And we were really struggling to keep up with that need, especially on a staff end, to kind of meet all the demands that there were to kind of serve mental health issues. So kind of getting more into what is self-harm and what are suicidal thoughts, right? The first thing I want to talk about again is self-harm. Of what is that? Both self-harm and suicidal ideation, often to a teen or adolescent or anybody really struggling with it, it's seen as a solution to a problem. It is coping, right? I tell my kids all the time, like, you're coping. Are we just coping in a way that we want to be coping, right? Are we coping in a way that's healthy or is going to give you the long-term benefits and life success that you want? And it's no, right? We can see that self-harm and suicide are short-term, and especially suicide is a permanent answer to often temporary issues, even intense and severe temporary issues. Non-suicidal self-harm is defined as direct, deliberate destruction to one's own body tissue in the absence of suicidal intent. Again, there's no suicidal ideation or thoughts there or desires for death. But it can look like, again, cutting oneself, and we see that with just general sharp objects in the home, a knife, especially if girls are the population that struggle with this the most. We see it a lot of taking kind of the razor blade out of their shaving razors. That's also really common. Even when I worked in a recovery treatment center, so they were very much so secured and did not have access to a lot of things. Some of these girls in those heightened emotional points would even break like a plastic ruler in half and use like the sharp edge from that to self-harm. So really any kind of sharp object. We also see it as a form of like people burning themselves. In younger kids, we'll even see like them scratching themselves with their fingernails until they're about raw. Or even like taking a pencil edge too and kind of using it that way. So it's not necessarily one specific way for a person to self-harm. There are many. And where people self-harm too varies. Many people self-harm on the wrist. That's the stereotypical place we think of when we think of self-harm. But I will say that kids are getting more secretive, for lack of a better word, of where and how they self-harm. So many teens have kind of gone to more hidden places on their body, such as even their like upper arm, which may be covered by a t-shirt sleeve, or their hip bone, which most likely is majority of the time going to be covered by pants or a shirt or a dress, right? Or their inner thighs, or again, their abdomen. So that too can kind of make it hard for us to be aware of self-harm occurring. So this dives a little bit more into suicidal thoughts. I mentioned earlier passive thoughts and active thoughts. And so now I kind of get to explain what that is. So really what suicidal thoughts are in general is just a thought, an idea, preoccupation with killing oneself. Active thoughts are somebody having a specific plan, intention, a thought out idea of how or when or where they would do this. So they've kind of got some action steps ready. Passive is less action oriented, and it's more so along the lines of kind of wishing for death. So an example of that could be something like, I just want to fall asleep and never wake up. Or if I wasn't here anymore, nobody would care about me. Or the world would be easier if I just didn't exist anymore. So there's no really specific plan or intention you see in that. It's just this desire to not be alive, or to have almost like an extended break is what a lot of kids kind of say. It is like, I don't necessarily want to die, but I feel like I need an extended break from life, right? Whereas again, like I said, the active thoughts, you're going to see more specific plans or ideas of like, I'm going to die in this way, or I'm going to die in this place, or I'm not going to die in this place. I've had a lot of clients be specific of, I don't know where I would kill myself, but I know I would go to the woods, or I would go somewhere isolated and alone again, touching back on that, it's a shameful thing. This is not something that people kind of brag about or parade around. Many people who have active thoughts do want to do it in secrecy and privacy because they don't want to hurt the people around them, but they also don't see the extent of how much those people would miss them. So kind of recognizing the signs. I went through some of this a little bit, and some of these do bleed together, but there are 3 categories I want us to look at to help us kind of recognize the signs. Generally, we can see behavioral signs, emotional signs, and physical signs. The behavioral signs can look like social withdrawal, isolation, stop participating in activities, especially activities that they love or that they normally enjoy. This one, I'll even try to flesh out or assess further with clients, especially when they're in that maybe earlier teen or tween stage, because they are maturing and developing. So they are maybe letting go of some old hobbies and activities and gaining some new ones, right? And so I kind of try and assess, are we just developing and maturing? And so our hobbies are changing and we're replacing one hobby for another potentially, or are we just stepping back and not engaging in any hobbies or activities at all anymore? Changes in friendship or relationships. Again, that kind of goes back to the social withdrawal or isolation. But one that I skipped over intentionally is that it can also be the opposite of that, in terms of like clinging or spending extra time with somebody, kind of like their last hurrah, their last goodbye, right? And that's where we may even see this one of giving things away, right? They want to kind of give their things away and give them to somebody that they know maybe care their things or like their things or whatever, kind of again as a symbol of goodbye. Emotional signs we may see, and this is something too where I know a lot of parents initially come in for intake and they say, oh, I just thought it was my teen being a teen, right? And these are some things that we see as teens are going through puberty and adolescence, and they're learning and they're growing and they're developing. And that's why it's important to look for maybe a symptom in all 3 of these areas, but also to kind of be aware of what is my child's like baseline or their quote unquote normal, and where maybe are we behaviorally, emotionally, or physically kind of deviating from that baseline or normal, right? And so with emotional signs, we'll see like an increased irritability. This can also look like having inappropriate emotional responses to situations. So maybe they're kind of blowing things out of proportion, or they're just responding maybe more verbally aggressive to things that are minor or shouldn't be responded to in that way. We also see just an increase in mood swings. Expressions of hopelessness, and this can even be expressions of worthlessness or even numbness, just feeling detached from themselves or the world. And then also an overall decreased sense of joy and happiness. And really what this looks like is a child or adolescent kind of demonstrating an inability to experience these feelings. Because in those moments, the hopelessness, the worthlessness, the numbness, that kind of takes over. And there's really not a lot of room for clients at all to kind of experience some of those more positive or pleasant feelings, right? And so that's something I think is key to be aware of too, is my child or my adolescent and teen just not really seem happy ever or at all anymore? Because then we may need to kind of assess further. And then with the physical signs, we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but kind of looking for unexplained cuts, bruises, marks. This even says wearing concealing clothing in warm weather. I've noticed even with like Gen Z and adolescent fashion these days, like just wearing jeans and long sleeves and covering up is kind of a trend. So I'd even take this a step further and looking for maybe wearing more concealing clothing in bizarre environments, right? So maybe it's at the gym and they're like in a full sweatsuit and you're like, that's kind of abnormal, right? Or maybe it's going to the pool and, you know, a child refuses to kind of maybe dress in normal pool attire that they would normally wear. And so just kind of also being on the lookout for that of like, is my child also concealing in inappropriate ways and inappropriate situations where normally they'd wear something that would show maybe some of these key parts of their body that I talked about earlier about where they would potentially self-harm. So why and when self-harm occurs, right? I've touched on it a lot, but a big piece of why self-harm occurs and when it occurs is emotional dysregulation. Oftentimes, when we get dysregulated emotionally, there's kind of a peak point of when those emotions become heightened, intensified, and they seem so overwhelming that it seems impossible that these feelings will ever go away. And so it's often in those senses, those intense moments, that we see a change in behaviors of wanting to self-harm or having suicidal thoughts. And it says here, alleviating sensory seeking urges, right? And again, if we think about maybe on a lesser scale for ourselves, when we have intense urges, right, or we have intense feelings, we do sensory seek as a way to cope and calm ourselves down, right? Maybe that's through stress eating. Maybe that's for going for a walk, or going to the gym. Maybe that's just through doing something that's self-soothing, like taking a bath. Or I personally like to wrap up in a blanket. That makes me feel really calm. So trying to find sensory ways to calm ourselves down is very normal, but doing it obviously through a way of self-harm or self-injury is not a healthy way to kind of find that. So that's something we often focus on in treatment, is helping clients and teens find additional ways to kind of calm themselves down and cope in those sensory moments, to help them focus on maybe more of a physical sensation in their body through their senses, rather than the internal sensations that are so high and so extreme, right? Another thing we see is a dopamine release, right? It has the term feel good in here, right? And we do see this with self-harm. Many clients do report it feeling good, which sounds really bizarre to individuals who maybe have never experienced self-harm, because it sounds like, well, you're hurting yourself. That never feels good, right? But you have to remember, when you're in that heightened emotional state, almost anything else in that moment feels better than those emotions, right? And so having that relief and that alleviation in a sensory form, it does feel good because it feels contrary to the emotional intensities that they're experiencing at that time. And so that correlation is built up. When dopamine is released in the brain, it's saying, oh, I self-harmed, I alleviated the intensified emotion, so that must be a good thing, right? And the brain obviously doesn't have that part to kind of reason and logic. No, we're self-harming. That's not healthy. We need to pick something else, right? But it can kind of build up this pattern of self-damaging behaviors. The next thing I kind of touched on, right, is timing. Again, it's really in that buildup and in that peak moment of intensified behaviors that those urges are going to happen the most. Again, I've had a lot of clients report maybe they don't have a specific plan when they are regulated and at their baseline, but in those intense moments, they say anything's possible. I'm just going to grab anything or do anything in the moment to make myself feel better, and it could be harmful or not harmful, right? And so again, it's just that timing of trying to help them find different ways in those peak intensified moments to kind of calm down and decrease that emotional distress. So you may ask for a specific time frame. What I've been told and trained in, and what I share to clients when I do safety planning, is 30 to 60 minutes is kind of our rough estimate for a good cool down period. And so when I do safety planning with clients, I often first ask, what coping skill can you do by yourself for 30 to 60 minutes that is completely and totally engrossing? And when I mean engrossing, like they are just lost in that coping skill, and it is something that is sensory to them and allows them to focus on that rather than the intense feelings. And that can be anything, right? I've had some kids, again, do exercising. I told one kid, I was like, just go do push-ups until you don't have those thoughts anymore. And he was like, I don't know if that'll work. And I was like, well, at least you'll get really buff. And we can find that as a pro to start with. And it did work. It was really effective for them. I've had other clients do things like baking or going for walks or just finding other hobbies and activities like drawing. So again, kind of where there's a little bit of movement involved and they're doing something that they can totally focus on with their mind. I will say TV and music is another one I hear often, and I let kids put that on their safety plan, but I always raise my little yellow flag with it. And what I say is TV and music and movies can be great. However, we all know that those things can also elicit different emotions in us, right? So I tell kids, be really careful what movies, TV shows, or music you're going to listen to during that heightened time, because the last thing we want is for those feelings to be intensified or compounded yet again. So find a show or a movie or music that actually helps you feel better. And maybe it helps you feel heard or seen. Maybe you find a sense of kind of collaboration in it, or find something that's completely contrary to what you're feeling. So watch something super funny or silly. Watch something that is just maybe really casual and easy to kind of focus on. But again, getting engrossed in it and not letting it intensify those feelings is always kind of the main goal. So moving on to understanding the triggers and motivations behind self-harm, right? We've talked a lot about just the day-to-day of what that looks like and how it potentially functions. But this allows us to maybe understand that why a little bit more. So first thing I want to go over is triggers. Anybody can be triggered by anything, right? And so I think just be sensitive to other people's triggers, whether that's academic stress, peer pressure, mental health, family dynamics, whatever it may be, right? Even with academic stress, especially in the area that we live in, this is a high one that I've experienced and seen a lot. I grew up in Washington, D.C., so I know the high academic stress that people can have. And the school that I went to growing up, if you didn't make straight A's, you were legitimately considered a failure. We were on I think an 8-point grading scale or something like that. So even a 90 was already a B. And I remember that being academically stressful, and it honestly disengaged me from education for a really long time. Again, peer pressure. Kids are dealing with all kinds of things today, and are getting pressure from all sorts of areas. And this is something that I really enjoy working with adolescents on, because developmentally they're in such a wonderful, weird, and confusing time that it is natural to want to assimilate to our peers, right? We want to find our people, where we connect, where we belong, where we feel safe, right? However, there is still this also strive for kind of wanting to find their individuality and the things that they love and want to be a part of, maybe on their own. And so I love to work with adolescents in that way too. And I think that alleviates a lot of this peer pressure, is allowing them to find the peers where they can be individual, but also feel connected and a sense of belonging from people. Again, mental health, especially when we deal with anxiety and depression, I really love to kind of ask the question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Because generally with anxiety, if you can imagine constantly worrying, not being able to turn off those thoughts, restlessness, just feeling tense 24/7, like that's hopeless, right? That's really frustrating. And so a lot of the times we see people who struggle with anxiety, especially if it goes untreated, they can also comorbidly develop major depression or a depressive disorder, because it is just feeling so lost and maybe some of those anxiety symptoms, right? And that's just one of many. There are other mental health diagnoses and concerns that can also lead to some of these self-harm or suicidal thoughts. And the last one, family dynamics, right? We're all a part of a family, and I think we can all attest to how stressful family can be. And so I think it's just, again, approaching that with humility and understanding, and being aware that sometimes family dynamics and just any kind of relationship is hard work. It's not anything that's ever easy. Next is kind of motivations. And I'm going to spend a few minutes, especially on these 4 points. This was something that I kind of picked out from a survey that I like to use with my clients. It's really helpful because usually when I'm working with adolescents or teens, one of them they can come in and they got 1 or 2 ideas of why they self-harm, right? Well, I don't want to feel angry. Okay, we can work with that. But the survey really breaks it down. I think there's I can't remember off the top of my head, but around 30 to 40 reasons as to why someone may self-harm. And these were the 4 categories I kind of broke it down to. I've mentioned communication. That was one of the first myths we dispelled, that self-harm and suicidal thoughts often is not attention-grabbing behavior, but it's a communication behavior of, again, remembering how shameful and embarrassing and difficult this is to talk about. I even think about maybe some of the people in this presentation, this may have been a hard presentation to come to, talking about these things is not easy, right? And so imagine even more struggling with these issues and not knowing how to verbalize that. Again, I had another client who directly said that. She just kind of shared, 1, I did it because I did want to communicate what I was struggling with. She said the second reason, which I thought was really powerful, was she said, I thought people wouldn't believe me and believe how severe my depression was unless I had to show them through self-harm. Again, it's not an attention-seeking behavior because they're not just trying to get attention for any reason, but it's feeling the pressure to prove how real her mental health struggles were through self-harm. So remembering that it's a communication tool. It's an unhealthy one, but that client or that person is usually wanting someone to ask on them and ask if they're okay and provide that support. Again, we've talked about emotional regulation a lot, but again, we see generally 2 ends of the spectrum of motivations with emotional regulation, not just to decrease the intense feelings they're having. That's definitely a huge part of it. But more specifically, we either see teens and adolescents wanting to not feel, right? I don't want to feel hopeless. I don't want to feel sad or upset or angry or mad or whatever else they may be feeling, right? Or we do also see the other end of the spectrum of I want to feel, right? And that may seem a little odd when I say that at first. But many teens who struggle with some of these issues also struggle with things like dissociation, where they feel detached and disconnected from their own body or their own environment. And so many people report they self-harm as a way to feel real or alive or to feel back in their body, because feeling disconnected and almost like in this dream state, for lack of a better way to describe it, is really disheartening. And so we see that with the emotional regulation too. It's this form of manipulation on either end of the spectrum of what they either don't want to feel or what they do want to feel to an extent. The next one is distraction or behavioral replacement, right? Again, these are behaviors, right? And so it's this idea of I'm going to try and cope in this way or distract myself in this way so I don't have to do X, Y, and Z, or don't have to experience X, Y, and Z. And so a lot of what we do in therapy with self-harm first is behavioral replacement. I'm going to put you on almost anything else instead of self-harming behaviors and self-damaging behaviors. And then we'll kind of get to, again, maybe some of those motivations and those issues behind it. And then the last one, again, is punishment. This is one that I think is a little bit more concealed a lot of the times when we think about self-harm or suicidal ideation. And this often happens when a client or individual has severe low self-esteem. Maybe they've perceived or have anxiety and they feel like they do things wrong a lot. They tend to place a lot of blame or personalize situations. And so they see self-harm as a way to punish themselves. So there's a lot of labeling here of I'm a bad person, I'm not worth good things, I shouldn't be alive. That's more on that borderline passive suicidal thought. And so they try to punish themselves because they feel like they deserve it, right? And so in that, we do a lot of self-esteem work, a lot of kind of reframing those distorted thoughts to kind of show that they have value, they have worth, and they don't deserve punishment for a lot of the times simple things that make them think they do deserve punishment. So we've obviously focused a lot on teens and adolescents and the self-harm, but how can you as a parent be supportive, right? This is the hardest part of knowing what to do. And the first thing I want to share is being open and having non-judgmental communication. And this is hard, right? This is something even my husband and I kind of squabble about sometimes, is that, I'll kind of present a problem and he'll immediately go to problem fixing or problem solving. And I'm like, that's not what I need right now. I just need to feel heard. I just need you to understand what I'm experiencing, right? And we've, I think, all been on both ends of those parties, right? We've all been the problem solver and we've all felt like we need less problem solving and more listening. And so I think it's first taking a step back and not trying to jump into problem solving mode immediately, and allowing the child just to feel safe and comfortable to kind of share maybe what they're processing. And with this too, this wasn't a myth that I specifically outlined, but I think it's definitely a myth that we can commonly have, that if I talk about suicide or self-harm, it's going to put the ideas in my kid's head. Honestly, if you're bringing it up with them and if you're having to talk with them about it, it's probably already there, right? So talking about it's not going to increase it, especially if we're doing it in an open and non-judgmental way, but it'll actually, again, provide that sense of relief, right? And anything that we feel shame with, it is very scary to talk about at first, but once we are able to feel safe and comfortable talking about those things, there is a weight lifted off of our shoulders, right? And it's the same thing for people struggling with self-harm and suicidal ideation. Once they have a safe person or safe space to talk about it, it's immediately like, oh my gosh, my eyes have been opened, the light has been turned on, and I don't feel so hopeless and alone anymore to deal with some of these things. It does provide a lot of hope. So don't be afraid to have these conversations. Also, don't be afraid to not have the answers. That's okay. I think, again, myself at 16, 17 years old, I didn't know what to do with my friend, right? But I knew I wasn't going to let him hurt himself. And so I was just there. I was just there and available and sat with him. And I think that's oftentimes the first step we need to take, is just to be there and to practice humility and kind of learning maybe what to do together. of let me walk alongside you to further understand this, and let me walk alongside you to also find what is going to work for my teen and my child, and helping them to find the coping skills to overcome some of these things. And that's the next thing, right? Help build coping skills. If you don't know what coping skills are, maybe you don't know your own coping skills, I think that's a great place to start. Learning what helps you de-stress or tolerate and understand some of those more intensified or uncomfortable feelings we have. And practice coping with your kids. Be open and honest of, hey, today's been just a stressful day. Maybe we go for a walk, or I'd love for you to come on a walk with me, right? Or, maybe telling your child, hey, if you want to do, baking as a coping skill, I'll bake with you, or I'll go to the store and help you get the ingredients you need, right? So coping alongside your child and modeling that kind of behavior for them to show that they've got some other options of things that they can do instead of the self-harming behaviors. And they don't have to do it alone if they don't want to, or doing it alone is too difficult. The next one, self-care. Provide self-care for yourself. I'm in the helping profession, and so I know that when we step into a crisis situation or an intensified situation, like it often is with self-harm and suicidal thoughts, we compartmentalize what we're feeling, right? Because that's what helps us at least just do what's necessary in those moments. And while there can be a lot of strength and pros to that, the con too can go from compartmentalizing to avoiding. And so I urge you not to avoid your own feelings, your own thoughts, maybe your own judgments or confusions about self-harm and suicidal ideation and what your teen is struggling with, but to provide yourself with self-care, giving your time to process your own thoughts and feelings about it in a safe space, finding supportive people, whether that's friends or family, a counselor, support groups, whatever it may be, so that you also are getting support, because supporting other people is really hard, right? And you can't pour from an empty cup. So please don't try to, because you will just burn yourself out. And as you're burning yourself out, your teen will also continue to emotionally struggle. And the last is safety planning. Again, when I conduct safety planning with clients, the first thing I tell them is view safety planning as a living document. Constantly be changing and updating it, especially for teens who are in this rapid time of growth in their lives. They're constantly developing and adding likes or dislikes to the repertoire. And so being aware that as they change and grow and become hopefully more self-aware about their self-harm behaviors or their suicidal ideations, that their safety plan needs to grow and change with them. And have open communication about what the child needs to feel safe and what you're able to kind of provide to make them safe, right? I think this needs to be approached as a team effort. Some compromises are going to have to be made, right? Especially maybe when it comes to like the cell phone or video games or things like that, where I know parents may have stricter rules on it and kids are like, well, I just want to play video games for 12 hours a day to cope. We're still going to have to set some limits with that, and that's okay. But making sure that it is a collaboration so that it will be effective for the team, but also doable for you to kind of support them and ensure their safety. So something I wanted to highlight as a part of our program at Connections is our comprehensive DBT program. This is the dialectical behavior therapy that I shared earlier that I was trained in. Connections has a great comprehensive program, and what a comprehensive program means is you're going to get individual counseling, but you're going to get a lot of other services with it. And even to step before that, what DBT means is dialectical behavior therapy is a proven method for individuals with high emotional sensitivity who are emotionally reactive, right? That doesn't mean just people who struggle with self-harm or suicidal ideations. We see this with other types of mental health disorders as well. But it does especially help for people with self-harm and suicidal ideations, because again, that's our crisis timing, right? And our crisis point is those high emotional moments and intensities, and when we want to emotionally just impulsively act on those urges, right? So what that program looks like, or the goals even before we get to the program of what DBT kind of focuses on, the first thing is to reduce self-harm, suicidal ideation, or just self-damaging behaviors. Like I said, not everybody who participates in DBT may have suicidal thoughts or self-harm, but they may still have self-damaging behaviors. That can be just impulsive behaviors. Sometimes it's sexual deviancy or risky behaviors. Sometimes it's substance use, right? It's just long-term and short-term behaviors that are going to cause harm. The second thing we want to look at in DBT is looking at behaviors that maybe get in the way of having productive therapy. Again, I've had a lot of clients who've been in and out of therapy their whole lives. And so I always make it a point to ask an intake, what has worked or what has not worked in your previous therapies? Sometimes I say that's the therapist's fault. So I keep that in mind. But sometimes too, they acknowledge I wasn't ready, or I didn't fully understand, or I didn't whatever, right? And so I always try, well, how are we going to do that differently this time? You're back in therapy. You seem more motivated than maybe you were before. How can we make those changes for you to be productive and use therapy in the best way? And so that's something else we get to focus on. Also, the main goal of DBT is helping people improve their life quality and reach their goals through, again, addressing some of those life interfering behaviors. What are things that are getting in the way for you, even if it's as simple as just having a bad daily routine? And how can we help you kind of change your routine to be more productive and reach the goals that you have on a day-to-day basis, which will obviously set them up for that long-term success as well. And then lastly, I've said this maybe a few times as well, but it is a lot of behavior replacement, right? It's kind of taking away the unhealthy behaviors and giving them wonderful skills of how to use them effectively so that they're able to not go to those unhealthy behaviors, but more productive ones that, again, are going to serve them lifelong. And so what that comprehensive program includes and looks like, usually if you find a comprehensive program anywhere, you're going to get several things. You're going to get individual counseling. You're going to have some sort of skills group or class, phone coaching, and consultation. Specifically, right now, what we have at Connections is we're setting up a teens only class. So maybe kids who aren't ready to have their parents very involved in what those things and struggles are for them. We do have a family class that is for parents and adolescents together to kind of learn these skills at the same time. And then we do have a parents class as well. So often if our teens are in a teens only class, we do ask that our parents participate in the parents only class. Again, you're learning the skills at the same time, just in different places, so that you can be working on these things together and be aware of how to, again, support your teen and maybe make some changes alongside with them to also kind of, again, cope with them, learn with them, grow with them, because we're all growing and learning lifelong, right? And then we do have an adults only class as well for adults. And what this skills class includes is it kind of has three primary sections we focus on. Mindfulness, which is looking at a lot of coping skills, but a lot of grounding techniques to kind of increase self-awareness, but also to learn how to include some of those sensory seeking urges and finding healthy outlets for them. So we can be mindful and aware in that moment that while we may be having really intense emotions, I can do things to kind of focus on other things in my environment or in my own body so that the emotions aren't the only thing that I can hear and listen in this moment, right? Again, emotional regulation, huge part of DBT, a huge part of just dealing with and treating self-harm and suicidal ideation. And then interpersonal effectiveness too, learning how to communicate and interact with other people in a more successful or efficient way, right? These are things that we do learn some as we grow and learn, but it is helpful for some of these things just to kind of be said out loud. And when I've done interpersonal effectiveness with a lot of kids, what I kind of share is like, this may not be entirely new or enlightening information, but now we're putting a name to something of how to be more intentional and use these skills more productively with the people around you. So again, to increase that sense of belonging and connection with other people in a healthy way. And then phone coaching and consultation team. Consultation team is for therapists primarily. At Connections, we meet every week for about an hour and a half to, one, just assess our DBT program. How is it working? What feedback are we getting? Are there any things we need to change or update? We also sit there and we assess our own maybe interfering behaviors into our DBT sessions and classes of maybe there's something personally as clinicians we can do and change to make therapy more effective for the people involved. So that's something that you have on the back end. And we do consult on cases as well. So I like to tell people you may be getting one specific therapist for individual therapy and two other therapists with the classes, but you're getting also a whole team behind the scenes that is there to support you and be there. And then the phone coaching. this is not designed to be counseling. I think that's kind of maybe our first initial guess when we hear what it is. It's not designed to be phone therapy, but it is designed to be a useful tool to kind of check in, especially in those moments when maybe a client has tried a skill or two. Maybe they don't even know where to begin, but they see their emotions intensifying and building up. And so they're wanting to kind of alleviate that. We have phone coaching as a possibility for them to give us a quick call, say, hey, I've tried this skill or I haven't tried any skills at all. What do I do? We review some skills that maybe they've learned. We ask them what skill they want to try. We end that 15-minute phone call because that's where we cap it. And then we ask them to follow up with us, either with a text or an email, or again, maybe another phone call of like, how did that work for you? Was it effective in that moment? So it's just another touch point throughout the week if needed for a client. And then as we're wrapping up, this just kind of gives you an overview of our practice at Connections Child and Family Center. We do accept most insurances, and then we do have self-pay as an option. And we do have a lot more than just the DBT program. We highlighted that because we do stand behind that as an effective treatment for self-harm and suicidal thoughts. But there's a lot more. We have like teleplay or play therapy. We have an eating disorder assessment in clinic that we're kind of getting up and running with a dietitian to kind of help assess maybe some of those needs. So all types of counseling is available. And then lastly, this is my information that I wanted to provide for y'all as well. Again, my name is Jessica McDuffie, and dealing with and working with individuals who have struggled with self-harm or suicidal ideation is just a passion of mine. I know it's not, again, an easy topic to always talk about, but I think if we're able to build that therapeutic relationship and have a safe place to kind of maybe dive deep into some of these things and stressors behind it, it's really something that can be overcome and doesn't have to be so scary or so overwhelming. And so again, if you have any questions about this at all, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to answer any questions. So again, here's my information if you have any idea or any questions of things that you'd like to ask me further. So I hope you enjoy this presentation. Thank you so much for attending. And we will have it available if you'd like to rewatch it at certain points. But that will probably be available in about 24 to 48 hours for y'all to watch. So again, thank you so much. And I hope y'all have a wonderful evening. I got to learn how to turn my presentation off.